You're telling me this call came from a phone that was reported missing 6 years ago? Captain Harold Whitman didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The way he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes sharp with disbelief, was enough to make the entire dispatch room feel smaller. "Yes, sir," the young dispatcher replied, swallowing hard. "The system verified the number twice." Whitman exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, dangerous. "Run it again." "We already did, 3 times." A pause. Then, "That phone belongs to a dead woman," Whitman said flatly. No one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. The dispatcher, Megan Cole, barely 24 and still new enough to flinch when supervisors stared too long, nodded nervously. Her name was Eleanor Price. She vanished in 2018. The phone was logged as missing the same night she disappeared. Whitman stood up. The chair scraped harshly against the floor. "And you're telling me that tonight at 2:17 a.m., that same phone called 911? "Yes, sir." Whitman looked around the room. Veteran officers, seasoned dispatchers, people who had heard screams, death rattles, last words. Every face wore the same expression: unease. "Did the caller speak?" Whitman asked. Megan hesitated. Whitman noticed instantly. "Hesitation tells me I won't like the answer." She did speak, sir." Whitman folded his hands behind his back. "Go on." Megan's voice dropped. She said, "Please don't hang up. He's back." Silence slammed into the room. Whitman's eyes hardened. "He? Who?" Megan shook her head. "That's the thing. Before we could ask, another voice came on the line." Whitman leaned forward. "Describe it." "It was a man, older, calm, almost amused." Whitman's jaw clenched. "And what did this amused man say?" Megan swallowed again. "He said, 'She's lying. She always lies.'" The air felt colder. Whitman straightened. "Trace the call." "We tried. The signal bounced, towers that don't even exist anymore. It finally dead-ended near Old Mill Road." A muscle jumped in Whitman's cheek. Old Mill Road. That wasn't just anywhere. "That's outside the city limits," he muttered, "near the abandoned textile housing." "Yes, sir." Whitman turned sharply. And then, the call disconnected. Whitman stared at the floor for a long moment, as if expecting it to answer him. "Who took the original missing persons report?" Megan checked her screen. "Detective Frank Nolan." Of course it was. Nolan had been arrogant, overconfident, the kind of detective who bullied witnesses and brushed off gut feelings if they didn't fit his theory. And what did Nolan conclude? Megan hesitated. Whitman snapped. "Spit it out, Megan." "He ruled it a voluntary disappearance, said Eleanor Price was unstable and probably ran off with someone." Whitman slammed his hand on the desk. "That son of a—" The room jumped. Whitman rarely lost his temper. When he did, it meant something was very wrong. She was 72 years old, a retired school librarian, no criminal record, no history of mental illness, and he labeled her unstable? Megan nodded. "Her neighbors said she was quiet, kept to herself, volunteered at the church." Whitman turned away, pacing now. "Where is Nolan?" "He's retired, moved to Arizona 2 years ago." Whitman stopped pacing. Convenient. He turned back to the room. "Pull Eleanor Price's file. Full history, medical records, financials. Everything." "Yes, sir." "And I want a unit rolling to Old Mill Road, now." A nearby officer frowned. "Captain, with respect, that area's been empty for years. No utilities, no residents." Whitman fixed him with a stare that shut him up instantly. "And yet a phone that doesn't exist just called from there." The officer nodded. "Understood." As officers scrambled, Megan hesitated, then spoke again. "Sir, there's one more thing." Whitman closed his eyes briefly.
There always is. The call, it reconnected. Whitman snapped his eyes open. When? 30 seconds ago. Whitman was already moving. Put it on speaker. Megan hit the button. Static filled the room. At first, then, breathing. Shallow. Uneven. Hello? Whitman said firmly. This is Captain Whitman. Who am I speaking with? A woman's voice trembled through the speaker. They said you wouldn't believe me. Whitman felt his stomach tighten. Ma'am, is this Eleanor Price? A pause. Then, yes. The room froze. Whitman leaned closer to the speaker. Eleanor, where are you? I don't know, she whispered. It's dark. He doesn't like when I ask questions. Whitman felt something cold crawl up his spine. Who doesn't like it? He asked gently. The line crackled. Then the man's voice returned, still calm, still amused. You really should have let this go, Captain. Whitman straightened. And who the hell are you? The man chuckled softly. Someone you already failed once. The call cut out. Dead. The room erupted into motion. Whitman turned sharply. Get me every unsolved case within 10 miles of Old Mill Road. Yes, sir. And Megan. She looked up. You did good, Whitman said firmly. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Her eyes welled slightly. Thank you, sir. Whitman faced the wall clock. 2:29 a.m. A phone missing for 6 years had just cried for help, and someone wanted the police to know. Whatever was buried back then wasn't buried deep enough. The evidence room smelled like dust and old paper, the scent of cases no one wanted to remember. Captain Harold Whitman stood beneath flickering fluorescent lights as a metal cart rattled toward him, stacked high with faded folders and cracked binders. Every file carried the same stamp in red ink: closed. Closed didn't mean solved. It meant forgotten. Eleanor Price, Whitman said. Top of the stack. The clerk hesitated. Sir, that file hasn't been opened in years. Whitman didn't look at him. Then it's overdue. The clerk slid the folder forward. It was thinner than Whitman expected. Too thin. Whitman opened it slowly, his jaw tightening with every page. A single-page incident report, a brief neighbor statement, one grainy photo of Eleanor, gray hair pulled neatly back, wire-frame glasses, eyes kind but sharp. No financial deep dive, no follow-up interviews, no forensic phone trace. This is it? Whitman asked. The clerk shifted. Detective Nolan closed it within 48 hours. Whitman's hands curled into fists. 48 hours. A 72-year-old woman vanished from her home, and the department had shrugged. Whitman flipped to the final page. Conclusion: voluntary disappearance, no foul play suspected. He slammed the folder shut. That's not police work, Whitman said. That's laziness dressed up as confidence. Behind him, Detective Angela Ruiz stepped closer. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, no patience for nonsense. I remember this case, she said. Nolan said Eleanor was confused, claimed she'd been overly attached to someone from her past. Whitman looked up. What someone? Ruiz shook her head. That's the thing, he never said. Whitman opened the file again, scanning. Where's her phone record? He demanded. Ruiz frowned. It should be here. It's not. They exchanged a look. Ruiz pulled up a chair. Captain, Nolan had a habit. Whitman glanced at her. Of? Deciding the ending before he read the story. Whitman exhaled slowly. Pull Nolan's old notes, he ordered. Everything he wrote that didn't make it into this file. Ruiz hesitated. That won't be easy. Whitman met her gaze. Easy is irrelevant. Minutes later, Ruiz returned with a thumb drive. This is what Internal Affairs archived when Nolan retired. Personal notes, draft reports, audio memos. Whitman plugged it into the computer. The screen filled with folders. He clicked one marked Price_E, drafts. The first memo crackled to life. Nolan's voice. confident, dismissive. Subject displays classic signs of emotional instability, claims someone keeps coming back from her past. No evidence supports this. Whitman paused the audio. Did he interview her? He asked. Ruiz nodded. Once, at her house. Whitman hit play again. Neighbor reports no signs of forced entry. Subject lives alone, likely left voluntarily to avoid personal stressors. Whitman slammed the spacebar. Stressors? He snapped. She was retired, widowed, financially stable. Ruiz leaned closer to the screen. There's more, she said. She clicked another file. A handwritten note appeared. Mentions a man named Thomas, refuses to clarify relationship, emotional reaction disproportionate. Whitman's eyes narrowed. Who's Thomas? Ruiz shook her head. That name never appeared in the official report. Whitman felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Nolan hadn't just dismissed Eleanor, he'd erased something. Run Thomas, Whitman said. Every Thomas connected to Eleanor Price. Old addresses, employment, marriage records. Ruiz's fingers flew across the keyboard. As the system churned, Whitman leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. Eleanor's voice echoed in his mind. Please don't hang up. He's back. Captain, Ruiz said quietly, I found something. Whitman leaned forward. Thomas Price, husband, declared dead in 1994, construction accident. Whitman's brow furrowed. Dead men don't come back. Ruiz nodded slowly. Unless they were never really gone. She clicked another tab. Look at this. Thomas Price wasn't recovered from the site. Body never found. Ruled accidental death due to collapse. Whitman's pulse quickened. And Eleanor? Ruiz continued scrolling. Here's the kicker. Thomas Price's death certificate was signed by... She stopped. Whitman stared. By who? Ruiz swallowed. Frank Nolan's brother, county coroner at the time. The room went silent. Whitman stood up slowly. This wasn't negligence, he said. This was protection. Ruiz nodded grimly. If Thomas Price was alive and dangerous, Nolan had every reason to bury it. Whitman paced, which means Eleanor didn't disappear. Ruiz finished his thought. She was silenced. Whitman's phone buzzed. Whitman, he answered. Officer Jenkins' voice came through, tense. Sir, we're at Old Mill Road. And? We found something. Whitman's spine stiffened. Kind of something? A structure, underground, power lines jerry-rigged, and... The line crackled. And signs of recent use? Whitman closed his eyes. Eleanor wasn't calling from the past. She was calling from captivity. Secure the perimeter, Whitman ordered. No media, no freelancers. And Jenkins? Yes, sir? Whatever you do, don't go in alone. Whitman ended the call and turned to Ruiz. They buried this case because they were afraid of what it exposed. Ruiz nodded grimly. And now it's clawing its way back. Whitman picked up Eleanor's thin file. For 6 years, she said quietly, she waited for someone to listen. He snapped the folder shut. Not anymore.
The road to Old Mill curled through a forgotten stretch of town where streetlights thinned out and memories thickened. Captain Whitman drove with both hands tight on the wheel, rain streaking across the windshield like nervous fingers. Detective Ruiz sat beside him, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, her jaw clenched in a way Whitman recognized. It was the look cops got when a case stopped being paperwork and started being personal. You hear that call again? Ruiz asked quietly. Whitman nodded. Twice. Eleanor Price's voice hadn't sounded hysterical. It hadn't sounded confused. It had sounded tired. Tired in the way people get when they've been ignored too long. The cruiser slowed as flashing blue lights came into view. 2 patrol cars blocked the narrow access road leading into a patch of woods so overgrown it looked like nature itself was trying to hide something. Officer Jenkins jogged toward them, rain soaking his uniform. Captain, he said, breathless, we traced the signal again. It's coming from down there. He pointed past the trees. Whitman stepped out of the car. The air smelled like wet earth and rust. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed faintly, too steady to be accidental. "How long has that structure been here?" Whitman asked. Jenkins shook his head. "Hard to say. Looks old, but the wiring's recent. Someone's been maintaining it." Ruiz crouched near a muddy patch of ground. "Footprints," she said. "Fresh." Whitman's stomach tightened. "Whose land is this?" he asked. "Technically abandoned. Used to be a quarry access point back in the 80s. Whitman exchanged a look with Ruiz. "Convenient," she muttered. They moved carefully through the brush until the trees thinned and the structure revealed itself, a low concrete bunker half swallowed by moss and vines. The door was steel, scarred with age, but the lock was new, too new. Whitman raised a hand. "Hold." He stepped closer, pressing his ear to the door. Inside, faint but unmistakable, came a sound. Breathing. Not machinery, not animals. Human. Whitman straightened slowly. "She's in there," he said. Ruiz's eyes hardened. "Alive?" Whitman nodded. "And not alone." They breached the door with controlled force. The lock snapped, metal groaning in protest as the door swung inward. The smell hit them first. Damp concrete, stale air, something medicinal. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow room lined with shelves, a cot, a small table, and, in the far corner, Eleanor Price. She sat upright on the cot, thinner than in her photo, gray hair tangled, eyes sunken but sharp. Her wrists were free, but the way she flinched told a story restraints didn't need to. She looked up. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Eleanor smiled faintly. "You finally came," she said. Ruiz swallowed hard. "Mrs. Price, it's the police." Eleanor nodded. "I know. I called you." Whitman stepped forward. "You've been missing for 6 years." Eleanor laughed softly. "No, I've been hidden." Paramedics rushed in moments later, wrapping Eleanor in a blanket, checking vitals. She complied calmly, answering questions with measured clarity. "She's dehydrated, but coherent, remarkably so," one medic murmured. Whitman crouched beside Eleanor. "Who did this to you?" he asked gently. Eleanor's smile faded. "My husband," she said. "Thomas Price?" stiffened Ruiz. "Yes, or whatever name he's using now." Whitman's voice lowered. "We thought he was dead." Eleanor's eyes glinted. "So did he want you to." As they helped her toward the exit, Eleanor paused, gripping Whitman's sleeve with surprising strength. "He's listening," she whispered. Whitman leaned in. "Who is?" Eleanor's voice trembled for the first time. "Thomas. He always listens." Back at the hospital, rain pounding against the windows, Whitman watched through the glass as doctors examined Eleanor. She spoke calmly, steadily, correcting them when they got details wrong. No confusion, no delusion, just memory. Ruiz joined Whitman with 2 coffees. "She's sharp," Ruiz said. "Too sharp for someone supposedly unstable." Whitman nodded. "Nolan lied." Ruiz took a sip. Or was told to. A nurse approached. "Captain, Mrs. Price is asking for you." Whitman entered the room alone. Eleanor sat propped up against pillows, hands folded neatly. "You were right to call," Whitman said. Eleanor studied him. "You sound surprised." He didn't deny it. "You said he was back." She replied, "He never left. He just learned how to disappear better." Whitman pulled up a chair. "Why keep you alive?" Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window. "Control. Thomas doesn't like loose ends. He likes witnesses who can't speak." "But you did speak tonight." Eleanor nodded. "Because he made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He thought time would erase me," she said quietly. "But time sharpens memory. It doesn't dull it." Whitman leaned forward. "We need everything. Names, places, habits." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "He's been using the department." Whitman froze. "Explain." "Thomas has friends," Eleanor continued. "Men who owed him favors, men who preferred quiet conclusions." Whitman's jaw tightened. "Nolan." "Yes, and others." Ruiz entered quietly, sensing the shift. "Captain," she said,
We ran facial recognition on old photos of Thomas Price. Whitman turned. And? He's alive. Different name, different beard, but the same eyes. Eleanor smiled grimly. Told you. Ruiz continued. He's been working private security contracts, consulting, staying just close to law enforcement to feel untouchable. Whitman felt a familiar anger rise, the kind that came when bullies hid behind badges and paperwork. You locked her away because you knew too much, Whitman said. Eleanor nodded. And because I refused to stop looking for the truth. Whitman stood. That ends now. Eleanor reached for his hand. Captain, when he realizes I'm gone, he won't run. Whitman met her gaze. What will he do? He'll hunt, because bullies don't lose quietly. Outside the room, Ruiz waited. He's out there, Whitman said. Ruiz nodded. And now we know we're coming. Whitman glanced back at Eleanor through the glass. For 6 years, she was silenced. Now the man who buried her voice is about to hear it echo. Ruiz's expression hardened. Good, she said. Let him choke on it.
By the time dawn crept over the city, Captain Whitman hadn't slept. Neither had the department. The hospital corridors buzzed with hushed urgency as word spread, not to the public, but through back channels, whispers between officers who had been around long enough to remember the name Eleanor Price and the case everyone pretended was finished. Whitman stood at the observation window, watching Eleanor speak with a trauma specialist. She sat upright, composed, answering questions with unnerving clarity. No tremor, no confusion, no cracks in her story. That alone terrified him, because it meant one thing. They had been wrong, and someone had made sure they stayed wrong. Detective Ruiz approached, holding a thin folder that looked heavier than it should have. I pulled everything on Thomas Price, she said quietly. Everything we thought we had. Whitman didn't look away from the glass. And it's clean, Ruiz replied. Too clean. Financial records wiped, death certificates signed off without a body, closed within 3 weeks. Whitman finally turned. 3 weeks for a missing person declared dead? Ruiz nodded grimly. Back then they called it compassion, said Eleanor was unstable, prone to delusions. Nolan signed off on it. Whitman's jaw tightened. Nolan's name had already begun to rot in his mouth. Thomas Price was a bully, Whitman said slowly. Not the loud kind, the quiet one, the kind who smiles while he corners you. Ruiz flipped the folder open. Former military contractor, psychological warfare division, specialized in containment strategies. Whitman snorted. That's one way to describe kidnapping your wife and locking her underground. Ruiz lowered her voice. There's more. He didn't just vanish, he embedded himself. She slid a photo across the desk. A man in his late 50s, trim beard, glasses, a consultant badge clipped to his jacket. Whitman felt his stomach drop. That's Thomas? Now he goes by Evan Price, spelled differently, works as a private risk assessment consultant. Guess who his biggest clients are? Whitman didn't need to ask. Police departments, he said. Ruiz nodded. Including ours. The silence that followed was heavy, poisonous. So he never left, Whitman muttered. He just stood closer. Across the hospital wing, Eleanor suddenly stiffened. Her eyes darted to the doorway, her breathing quickening. Whitman noticed instantly. What is it? Ruiz asked. Whitman was already moving. They entered the room as Eleanor clutched the blanket, her knuckles white. He knows, Eleanor whispered. Whitman crouched beside her. Who knows? Thomas, Eleanor said, voice shaking for the first time. He always knows when I speak his name too loudly. Ruiz glanced toward the hallway instinctively. Mrs. Price, you're safe here, Whitman said calmly. There is no safe when men like him exist. Whitman took her hand. You survived 6 years because you're stronger than him. Eleanor met his gaze. No, I survived because he needed me afraid. That sentence hit harder than any confession.
By mid-morning, Internal Affairs arrived. Uninvited. 2 men in pressed suits walked into the bullpen like they owned it, badges flashing just long enough to remind everyone who really held power. "Captain Whitman," one of them said coolly, "we need a word." Whitman didn't move. "You'll wait." The man raised a brow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Whitman said, voice steady but iron hard. "I'm not stepping away from an active case involving corruption until I decide who gets briefed." The second agent scoffed. "This department doesn't decide that." Whitman finally looked at them. "Then maybe that's the problem." Ruiz watched from nearby, pulse racing. She'd seen bullies before, men who relied on rank and procedure like armor, but Whitman wasn't flinching. The first agent leaned in. "Careful, Captain. You're poking a system that buried this once already." Whitman smiled coldly. "Then it shouldn't have left fingerprints." The agent straightened. "We're freezing your access to the case pending review." Whitman shrugged. "Too late." Ruiz stepped forward. "What do you mean, too late?" Whitman turned to her. "I sent copies of everything to the state attorney last night, including Nolan's signatures." The agents' faces tightened. "You went over our heads," one hissed. Whitman's eyes were steady. "You went over justice." The men left without another word, but the threat lingered like smoke. That afternoon, the media got wind. Not the full story, just enough. Missing woman found alive after 6 years. Police reopened closed case amid questions. Phones rang non-stop. Protesters gathered outside the station by evening, some demanding answers, others defending the department blindly, shouting that Eleanor must be lying. Bullies thrive in confusion. Eleanor watched the news silently from her hospital bed. "They'll say I imagined it," she murmured. Whitman shook his head. "Not this time." She looked at him. "They always say that when women survive men like him." Whitman didn't argue, because she was right. That night, Ruiz pulled another thread. She tracked Evan Price's last known location. "He was at a private security conference 2 days ago. He left early." Whitman leaned over the map. "Where is he now?" Ruiz swallowed. "Close." "How close?" "Within 20 miles. Whitman exhaled slowly. "He's not running." "No," Ruiz said. "He's positioning." At 11:47 p.m., Whitman's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at it, then answered. A calm male voice filled the line. "Captain Whitman," the voice said pleasantly, "you're making quite a mess." Whitman's blood grew cold. "Who is this?" he asked, though he already knew. A soft chuckle. "You know who this is." Ruiz's eyes widened as Whitman put the call on speaker. "You took something that belongs to me, and now you're parading it like a trophy." Whitman's voice was ice. "She's not something, she's a person." A pause. Then, "Still correcting language. Admirable. Ineffective." Ruiz clenched her fists. "You kept her locked away for 6 years. That ends now." Another chuckle. "I kept her safe from a world that wanted to break her." Whitman snapped. "You broke her." Silence. Then the voice hardened. "No, Captain. I refined her." Whitman felt a surge of rage. "You're a coward hiding behind systems and fear." The man sighed. "And yet those systems protected me perfectly until you got emotional." Ruiz leaned closer to the phone. "We're coming for you." The voice laughed softly. "You already are." The call ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. Whitman finally said, "That wasn't a threat." Ruiz nodded. "It was an invitation." Whitman looked toward the hospital window, where Eleanor slept under guard. "This time," he said, "the bully doesn't get to choose the ending." Outside, the city pulsed with tension, unaware that a man who had lived in its shadows for years had just stepped back into the light, and this time, he was no longer invisible.
By sunrise, the city no longer whispered, it roared. News vans lined the streets outside the precinct, satellite dishes angled like weapons. Protest signs clashed in the morning light, some demanding justice for Eleanor Price, others screaming loyalty to the batch, accusing the department of witch hunts and fake victims. The silence that had protected Thomas Price for years was gone, and men like him never survived noise. Inside the station, tension hung thicker than cigarette smoke ever had back when Whitman first wore a uniform. Officers spoke in half sentences, eyes darted. Old alliances cracked under pressure. Detective Ruiz stood at the evidence board, red string now spiderwebbing the wall. Photos of Eleanor, financial records, shell companies, training conference badges, and at the center, a blown-up image of Evan Price, or Thomas, depending on which lie you believed. Whitman entered, coffee untouched in his hand. State attorney called. They're convening a task force. Ruiz looked up. Independent? Whitman snorted. As independent as politics allows, but Nolan's been placed on administrative leave. That landed hard. Nolan wasn't just any former captain. He was a legend to some, a warning to others, the kind of man bullies hid behind because he was the system. About damn time, Ruiz muttered. Whitman leaned against the desk. He's lawyered up already. Of course he has. Men like him never wait to be questioned. Across the room, Officer Jenkins slammed a locker shut harder than necessary. You really think this won't blow back on us? He snapped. Half the city already thinks she's lying. Ruiz turned slowly. Say that again? Jenkins bristled. I'm just saying, memory after trauma isn't reliable. Everyone knows that. The room went dead quiet. Whitman's voice was calm, too calm. Careful. That line's been used to bury women for decades. Jenkins swallowed. I didn't mean... Yes, you did, Ruiz cut in, and that's why men like Thomas Price thrive, because people like you ask for perfection from victims and blind loyalty from institutions. Jenkins looked away. Whitman didn't raise his voice. If you're uncomfortable with accountability, you can request reassignment. Jenkins said nothing. Later that morning, Eleanor asked to speak publicly. Whitman hesitated. You don't know anyone anything. Eleanor sat straighter in her hospital bed. Her voice was quiet but steady. I spent 6 years being told silence would keep me safe. It didn't. By noon, she stood at a podium outside the hospital, flanked by Ruiz and Whitman. Cameras flashed relentlessly. Eleanor didn't flinch. My name is Eleanor Price, she said into the microphones. For 6 years, I was declared dead when I was very much alive. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I was hidden, controlled, silenced by a man who understood systems better than compassion. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces, skeptics, supporters, survivors, and those systems helped him. The words landed like a punch. Across town, in a glass-walled office overlooking the river, Thomas Price watched the broadcast in silence. He sat comfortably, legs crossed, hands folded. His phone buzzed endlessly, colleagues, consultants, friends suddenly remembering they had meetings elsewhere. He turned the volume down. Poor Eleanor, still performing for approval. His assistant hesitated in the doorway. Sir, should we respond publicly? Thomas smiled thinly. No, let them exhaust themselves. He opened his laptop, pulling up familiar dashboards, access points, personnel databases, security feeds. Old habits. Outside, Eleanor finished her statement with words that sent a chill through every bully watching. I survived not because the system saved me, but because I refused to disappear completely. Reporters shouted questions. Mrs. Price, do you forgive him? Eleanor paused. No, she said simply. I want accountability. That night, the backlash exploded. Social media turned savage. Some called her brave, others called her unstable, a liar, a gold digger chasing headlines. Anonymous accounts dissected her appearance, her tone, her pauses. The cruelty was relentless. Ruiz scrolled through her phone, jaw clenched. They're tearing her apart, she said. Whitman nodded grimly. That's what happens when the silence breaks. Bullies recruit the crowd. At the hospital, Eleanor read none of it. Instead, she asked for a notebook. She began writing. Every day, every memory, dates, smells, sounds, not to convince anyone, but to reclaim herself.
Meanwhile, pressure mounted inside the department. 2 officers were suspended pending investigation. 1 resigned. Another tried to destroy files and was caught. The truth was spreading like a crack through concrete. Then came the tip. Anonymous, short, precise. Check Pier 17, old storage facility. He keeps trophies. Ruiz stared at the message. That word again. Whitman nodded. Bullies always keep proof. They need reminders of power. They moved fast. No sirens, no press. Just a handful of officers who still believed the badge meant something. The warehouse at Pier 17 smelled like salt and rust. The door was unlocked. Inside, boxes lined the walls. Ruiz opened one. Personal items, women's shoes, scarves, IDs. Her stomach turned. "This isn't just Eleanor," she whispered. Whitman's face hardened. "It never is." Footsteps echoed. They turned, weapons drawn. But it wasn't Thomas. It was a teenage girl, shaking, eyes wide. I was told to clean," he said. "He said no one comes here." Ruiz gently lowered her gun. "Who told you?" She swallowed. "Mr. Price." Whitman closed his eyes briefly. The silence broke again, inside him. Back at the station, warrants flew faster than ink could dry. The task force expanded overnight. Federal interest followed. Thomas Price's carefully constructed invisibility began to crumble. And for the first time in years, he felt it, that faint tightening in the chest, the sensation bullies hate most, fear. Because when silence dies, so does control.
By the next morning, Thomas Price woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years, noise he didn't authorize. His phone vibrated non-stop on the glass nightstand of his high-rise apartment. Not messages asking for guidance, not invitations, not the quiet respect of people who once deferred to him. This noise was different. This noise demanded answers. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment before reaching for the phone, already knowing what he'd see. Notifications stacked like accusations, news alerts, missed calls, emails with subject lines that used words like urgent and review and suspension. The silence that had protected him for years was gone, and it terrified him more than he would ever admit. Across the city, Captain Whitman stood in front of a room full of uniforms and plainclothes officers. The briefing room was packed beyond capacity. People leaned against walls. Others stood in the hallway, arms crossed, listening through the open door. No one joked. No one checked their phones. On the screen behind Whitman was a single image, the interior of the Pier 17 storage facility. Boxes, labels, personal belongings, proof. "This is no longer an internal matter," Whitman said, his voice steady but heavy. "This is a criminal investigation involving multiple victims, systemic failures, and intentional suppression of evidence." A murmur rippled through the room. He continued, "Anyone who obstructs this investigation will be treated as a suspect, not a colleague." That landed hard. A hand went up in the back. "Captain, are we sure about this? I mean, this man consulted for half the department." Whitman didn't hesitate. "That's exactly why we're sure." Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. Bullies didn't operate alone. They never had. Ruiz stood beside the board, flipping to the next slide. "We've identified at least 7 women connected to properties linked to Thomas Price. Some reported missing, some written off as transient, some never reported at all." The room went silent. "These items," she continued, pointing to the image, "were cataloged, preserved. That's not accidental, that's ritual." One older detective muttered, "Jesus." Whitman folded his arms. "This isn't about one monster. It's about the comfort we allowed him." No one argued. Meanwhile, Eleanor watched the press conference from her hospital room. She sat wrapped in a blanket,
hands resting calmly in her lap. Her reflection in the TV screen looked older than her years, not broken, but sharpened. A nurse entered quietly. "You doing okay?" Eleanor nodded. "I've been quieter places." The nurse hesitated. "Some of the comments out there are cruel." Eleanor smiled faintly. Cruelty thrives in crowds. Her phone buzzed, a message from a number she didn't recognize. "He's losing control. Be careful." She stared at it for a long moment before deleting it. Across town, Thomas Price sat at his desk, tie loosened, jacket draped over the chair. His apartment was immaculate, as always, minimalist, controlled, curated. He replayed the footage from the pier in his mind. The girl, the boxes, the word trophies. That had been careless. He prided himself on never being careless. His assistant stood near the door, pale. "Sir, 3 contracts have been suspended. 2 departments have cut ties completely." Thomas leaned back slowly. Temporary panic. "Sir, the federal task force to take months, years, if handled correctly." "But Eleanor Price." His jaw tightened. "That woman," he said softly, "is emotional. The public's attention span is short." The assistant swallowed. "What should we do?" Thomas smiled. "We remind them who controls the narrative." By evening, the counterattack began. Anonymous leaks hit the internet, old psychiatric evaluations of Eleanor, selectively edited, a forged email implying financial motives, a grainy photo of her entering the hospital labeled "staged return." The backlash was swift and vicious. Talk shows debated her credibility, commentators questioned timelines. Former colleagues of Thomas Price suddenly appeared on panels calling him misunderstood and brilliant. Ruiz watched one segment in disgust. "They're doing it. They're burying her again." Whitman shut the TV off. "Not this time." He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "State Attorney Mills," he said when the line connected. "It's Whitman. We need to accelerate." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from awareness. She sensed it, the tightening of the air, the way bullies push hardest when they feel cornered. At 2:17 a.m., the hospital's power flickered. Just once. Her eyes snapped open. Moments later, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Too slow for nurses, too deliberate. Eleanor sat up, heart steady. She had lived with fear long enough to recognize its shape. The door handle turned slightly, then stopped. A voice murmured outside. Wrong room. The footsteps retreated. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Across town, Thomas Price sat at his desk, tie loosened, jacket draped over the chair. His apartment was immaculate, as always, minimalist, controlled, curated. He replayed the footage from the pier in his mind. The girl, the boxes, the word trophies. That had been careless. He prided himself on never being careless. His assistant stood near the door, pale. "Sir, 3 contracts have been suspended. 2 departments have cut ties completely." Thomas leaned back slowly. Temporary panic. "Sir, the federal task force to take months, years, if handled correctly." "But Eleanor Price." His jaw tightened. "That woman," he said softly, "is emotional. The public's attention span is short." The assistant swallowed. "What should we do?" Thomas smiled. "We remind them who controls the narrative." By evening, the counterattack began. Anonymous leaks hit the internet, old psychiatric evaluations of Eleanor, selectively edited, a forged email implying financial motives, A grainy photo of her entering the hospital labeled "Staged Return." The backlash was swift and vicious. Talk shows debated her credibility. Commentators questioned timelines. Former colleagues of Thomas Price suddenly appeared on panels calling him misunderstood and brilliant. Ruiz watched one segment in disgust. They're doing it. They're burying her again. Whitman shut the TV off. Not this time. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "State Attorney Mills," he said when the line connected. "It's Whitman. We need to accelerate." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep.
Not from fear, but from awareness. She sensed it, the tightening of the air, the way bullies push hardest when they feel cornered. At 2:17 a.m., the hospital's power flickered. Just once. Her eyes snapped open. Moments later, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Too slow for nurses, too deliberate. Eleanor sat up, heart steady. She had lived with fear long enough to recognize its shape. The door handle turned slightly, then stopped. A voice murmured outside. Wrong room. The footsteps retreated. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Across town, Whitman's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered instantly. "Captain," Eleanor said calmly, "he's testing boundaries." Whitman sat upright. "Are you safe?" "Yes," she replied, "but he's not finished." Whitman's voice hardened. "Neither are we." By morning, warrants would issued, not just for Thomas Price, but for anyone who had helped him disappear evidence, suppress reports, or intimidate witnesses. Names surfaced. Big ones. The task force doubled. Federal agents arrived unannounced at city offices. Doors closed. Hard drives seized. Careers ended quietly. Thomas watched the news in silence. The narrative was slipping. Not because Eleanor screamed, but because she endured. That unsettled him more than rage ever could. He poured himself a drink, hands steady. "You survived because I allowed it," he muttered to the empty room. But the words felt weaker than before. Because deep down, he knew something had changed. The city wasn't quiet anymore. And bullies, for all their strategy, couldn't survive the noise forever. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Not for chaos, but for reckoning. And somewhere between the past he controlled and the future he couldn't, Thomas Price felt the walls closing in. By the time dawn broke, the city no longer belonged to Thomas Price. It belonged to the truth. Unmarked cars lined the street outside his building before the sun cleared the skyline. Men and women in dark jackets moved with quiet precision, badges flashing only when necessary. No sirens, no spectacle, just inevitability. Inside his penthouse, Thomas stood at the window, coffee untouched, watching them arrive. He had always believed reckoning came with chaos, shouting, accusations, dramatic arrests. This was worse. This was calm. A knock came at the door, firm, patient, unavoidable. Thomas adjusted his cufflinks before opening it. He forced a smile, as if welcoming guests to a fundraiser. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly. "Thomas Price," the lead agent replied, voice neutral. "You're being detained pending questioning in connection with obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and evidence suppression." Thomas chuckled softly. "That's quite a list." The agent didn't smile. "We're just getting started." They stepped inside, eyes scanning the immaculate apartment. One agent moved toward the office, another toward the bedroom. Thomas raised a finger. "If I may—" "Sir," the agent interrupted, "you may remain silent." That stung more than he expected. Across town, Eleanor watched the live update on a muted television. She sat in a small conference room at the district attorney's office, wrapped in a cardigan Ruiz had brought her. Ruiz stood near the window, arms crossed. "They took him," Ruiz said quietly.
Eleanor nodded once. No smile, no relief, just a deep, steady breath. Good. Now the others will talk. Ruiz glanced at her. You are certain? Eleanor met his gaze. Bullies don't stay loyal when the power shifts, they scatter. She was right. By noon, subpoenas were flying. A retired judge resigned abruptly. A former police chief refused interviews. A city councilman canceled a public appearance citing health reasons. The machine that had protected Thomas Price for decades was grinding itself apart, gears screaming as secrets spilled. Inside an interrogation room, Thomas sat across from two federal investigators. The mirrored glass reflected his composed posture, legs crossed, hands folded. Let's be clear, he said calmly. I advise departments on protocol. I never ran investigations. One agent slid a file across the table. Photos, logs, emails, a copy of a property deed tied to Pier 17. Thomas's eyes flickered for the first time. That facility, the agent said evenly, was leased under a shell company traced directly to you. Thomas leaned back slowly. Circumstantial. The second agent leaned forward. Then explain why the phone recovered from Eleanor Price was routed through a private exchange registered in your name. Silence. The room seemed to tighten. Thomas smiled thinly. You're giving one woman a lot of power. No, the agent replied. You gave her power. You just forgot she still had it. Hours later, the pressure cracked somewhere else. A former colleague, nervous, sweating, walked into the DA's office with a lawyer. He talked, then another, then another. Stories overlapped, dates aligned, names repeated. The pattern became undeniable. This wasn't negligence, it was design. Eleanor listened from the hallway, every word like a stone being lifted from her chest. For years she had been told she was mistaken, emotional, unreliable. Now men with credentials in corner offices were repeating her truth, shaking voices, lowered eyes. Captain Whitman approached her quietly. They're offering plea deals. She looked up at him. For him too? Whitman hesitated. He's fighting. Eleanor nodded. He always does. That evening, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Not protesters, not supporters, just people, holding signs with names. Women, men, families. Some cried. Some stood silently. Eleanor stepped outside briefly, flanked by Ruiz. A murmur rippled through the crowd when they recognized her. Someone called out, "We believe you." Another voice followed, "Thank you." Eleanor's throat tightened. She hadn't expected gratitude. She hadn't done this to be thanked. She did it because the phone rang. Back inside, Thomas watched the footage from a holding room television. Her face, calm, unbroken, respected. Something twisted inside him. Not anger, fear. He leaned toward the guard. "I want to make a call." "You've had your calls," the guard replied flatly. Thomas sank back. For the first time he felt small. Not powerless yet, but exposed. Late that night, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment. The city hummed outside, unaware of how much had shifted beneath it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Hello?" Silence. Then a familiar voice. "You've ruined lives," Thomas said quietly. Eleanor closed her eyes. "You ruined your own." "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "You think the system changes because of you?" She breathed steadily. "No, I think it changes because people finally listened." A pause. "You were nothing," Thomas said bitterly. "A missing girl." Eleanor opened her eyes, gaze steady. "I was evidence." The line went dead. Eleanor set the phone down. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. Across the city, Thomas Price stared at the blank screen. For years, he had silenced voices, controlled narratives, buried phones. But one call, one voice refusing to disappear, had undone everything. And as the night deepened, Thomas realized something chilling. This reckoning wasn't ending with his arrest. It was just beginning. Because the truth, once heard, never went quiet again.
The courtroom was silent in a way Eleanor had never experienced before. Not the tense silence of anticipation, not the forced quiet of authority. This was different. This was reverence. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, pens poised but unmoving. Even the judge sat unusually still, hands folded, eyes heavy with the knowledge of what this case had already changed. Thomas Price sat at the defense table, older now, smaller. The confidence that once radiated from him had thinned into something brittle. His expensive suit hung a little looser, his jaw clenched as if holding back words that no longer mattered. Eleanor sat across the aisle, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't slept much the night before, not from fear, from memory. Because when the system finally opens its doors to you, it doesn't just invite justice in, it lets everything else follow. The judge cleared his throat. "Before we proceed," he said slowly, "this court will hear from Ms. Eleanor Price." A murmur rippled through the room. Eleanor stood. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate. She walked to the stand like someone who had already crossed the hardest distance years ago. She raised her hand, took the oath, and sat. The prosecutor nodded. "Ms. Price, tell us about the call." Eleanor inhaled. "I didn't know it was possible. I didn't know a phone that disappeared with me could still exist. I thought it was gone, just like I was supposed to be." Her voice was steady, not rehearsed, not fragile. "When it rang, I didn't feel scared. I felt recognized, like something that had been buried finally remembered it was alive." Across the room, Thomas stared at the table. Eleanor went on. "I was 16 when I was taken. I was loud, curious. I asked questions people didn't like. That's what made me inconvenient." A few jurors shifted in their seats. "I was told no one would believe me, that if I spoke up, things would get worse, and they were right for a while." She paused, fingers tightening together. "But silence doesn't erase truth, it just delays it." The prosecutor asked gently, "What happened when you heard his voice again?" Eleanor looked straight ahead. "I realized he had never stopped listening. He kept the phone because it reminded him that I existed, that what he did was real." Thomas's lawyer objected weakly. The judge overruled it. Eleanor continued. "That phone didn't call the police by accident. It rang because the past doesn't stay buried forever." When she finished, the courtroom remained quiet. No applause, no movement, just understanding. Thomas was given the chance to speak. He stood slowly, one hand gripping the table. "I built a career on protecting institutions," he said, voice hoarse. "I believed chaos was worse than injustice." He looked at Eleanor for the first time. "I told myself I was maintaining order." Eleanor didn't look away. "You were maintaining power," she said quietly. The judge didn't interrupt. Thomas swallowed. "I thought if enough time passed, it would disappear." Eleanor nodded once. "So did I. I was wrong. So were you." The verdict came less than an hour later. Guilty, on all counts. As Thomas was led away, cameras flashed, but Eleanor didn't watch. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. Reporters shouted questions, microphones surged forward. Eleanor raised one hand. "I don't have much to say, except this. If you're holding something inside because you think no one will listen, you're wrong."
She stepped away before they could ask more. That evening, Eleanor returned to her apartment. It was quiet, peaceful. She sat at her kitchen table and placed the phone in front of her. The same phone, the one that had traveled through darkness and silence and time. She turned it over in her hands. Then she powered it off. For good. Weeks later, changes rippled outward. Cold cases reopened, policies rewritten, oversight committees formed. Not because of outrage, because of evidence. Eleanor declined interviews. She turned down a book deal. She didn't want fame. She wanted closure. One afternoon, she received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten. I was wrong to stay quiet. I heard your story, and it gave me courage to tell mine. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. Then another arrived. And another. Voices long silenced finding their way back. Months passed. One evening, Eleanor stood on her balcony watching the city lights flicker on. Her phone buzzed. This time it was a friend. "Dinner tomorrow?" the message read. Eleanor smiled. "Yes," she typed back. She set the phone down and looked out at the skyline. For years, she had lived with the echo of a call that never came. Now she understood something simple and powerful. Truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to ring once, loud enough, and refuse to be ignored. And somewhere, deep inside every system built on silence, there is always a phone, waiting to be answered.